The sound of the Ginza line at night is a low, rhythmic thrum, but on that Tuesday, the security monitor didn't show a train. It showed a man standing perfectly still on the tracks, staring directly into the lens of camera 4. He wasn't moving, he wasn't blinking, and most disturbingly, he was holding a handheld radio to his ear, as if waiting for a command from the concrete itself. When the transit police arrived minutes later, the tunnel was empty, leaving behind only a faint scent of ozone and a single, yellowed architectural blueprint weighted down by a heavy iron bolt. The blueprint wasn't a standard city map. It was a granular, hand-drawn schematic of the Shinjuku interchange, marked with red ink in places that shouldn't exist. Investigators found the document tucked into a ventilation gap that had been surgically widened, just enough for a human hand to slip through. As they unfurled the vellum, the detectives realized the ink was fresh. Yet the paper was decades old, smelling of damp earth and stale cigarettes. It felt less like a discarded plan, and more like a confession written in the language of steel and stone. The case it reopened was the ghost of the Hibiya Line, a string of disappearances from the late 90s that had paralyzed Tokyo. Back then, commuters would vanish between stations, leaving nothing but a lingering sense of cold air in the cars they occupied. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, and most importantly, no way out of a moving train. The blueprint found near the tracks suggested that the exit wasn't through the doors, but through a structural anomaly designed into the very foundation of the city. As forensic architects analyzed the red markings, they discovered a terrifying pattern. Every disappearance coincided with a specific vibration. Frequency of the express trains. The killer wasn't just a predator, he was a student of resonance, knowing exactly when the noise would drown out a scream or the sound of a prying tool. The blueprint highlighted dead zones where the surveillance cameras had a 3-second lag during power transitions. It was a manual for a ghost, a guide on how to become invisible by synchronizing one's movements with the heartbeat of the subway. The emotional weight hit when the team realized the red dots on the map represented the exact coordinates where the missing passengers' belongings had been found years prior. A single earring, a leather briefcase, a child's charmel, recovered in maintenance crawl spaces that weren't on the official city plans. This meant the killer hadn't just used the subway. He had inhabited it, living in the interstitial spaces between the walls, watching the city move from the darkness of the vents. Detectives began interviewing the original 1998 task force, finding a group of broken men who still looked over their shoulders in the station. One retired inspector recalled a maintenance consultant who always seemed to be present during the searches, a man who knew the tunnels better than the engineers. He was a shadow in a hard hat, someone so essential to the infrastructure that he became part of the background noise. They had ignored him because he was the one holding the flashlight, leading them away from the very voids he had created. The blueprint's most chilling detail was a series of breathable wall sections of concrete that looked solid but were actually hollowed out to act as acoustic chambers. By standing behind these thin shells, someone could listen to the private conversations of passengers on the platform. The killer wasn't looking for victims. He was selecting voices, choosing people whose lives he wanted to steal. He didn't just want their bodies. He wanted to understand the rhythm of their existence before he pulled them into the silence. The investigation pivoted to the origin of the paper itself, a rare heavy-duty vellum, used only by the Tokyo Bureau of Transportation in the 1970s. This narrowed the field to a generation of architects who had literally built the modern underground. One name kept appearing in the margins of the city's construction: Archives Sato. He was a prodigy of structural integrity, who had resigned abruptly after the completion of the Shinjuku expansion, claiming the tunnels were talking to him. He hadn't left the project, he had simply moved inside of it. Searching for Sato was like chasing a phantom through a mirror. There were no tax records, no bank accounts, and no death certificate. He had effectively deleted his civic identity while maintaining his physical presence within the city's arteries. The blueprint was his curriculum vitae, a map of a life lived in the dark, showing how he had redirected ventilation shafts to heat his hidden cells, and tapped into the subway's electrical grid to power a world beneath the commuters' feet. The team focused on a specific anomaly in the blueprint labeled the archive. Was located directly beneath the busiest platform in Tokyo, a space that should have been solid, reinforced concrete. When they bored a hole into the floor of the maintenance closet, they didn't hit earth. They hit a hollow chamber. Lowering a fiber optic camera, They saw a room lined with thousands of carefully labeled cassettes. Sato hadn't just been watching, he had been recording the city for 30 years. A sonic voyeur of the subterranean world. The tension in the room snapped when the audio from the camera began to transmit. It wasn't just white noise. It was the sound of a woman humming a lullaby, recorded only days ago. The ghost was still there, and he was still listening. The blueprint wasn't a relic of a cold case. It was an active invitation. He wanted them to find the archive because he was finished with his masterpiece. And the final red ink on the diagram pointed to a structural support beam that was being systematically compromised. Engineers warned that if the support beam identified in the blueprint failed, the entire station above would collapse into the tunnels. It was a countdown written in structural fatigue. The killer had turned the city's growth into its own death warrant, using the weight of the morning commute to drive the final nail into the foundation. Every person who stepped onto the platform was unknowingly contributing to the pressure that would eventually crush them. A poetic and horrific symmetry that Sato had spent decades perfecting. The psychological profile of Sato shifted from a simple murderer to a man who viewed the subway as a living organism and himself as its surgeon. He believed he was curing the city of its congestion by removing the people he deemed unnecessary, recycling their echoes into his tapes. The terror among the investigators was palpable. They weren't just looking for a man, they were trying to stop a building from committing a calculated act of violence against its occupants. As they moved deeper into the restricted zones, the air grew thick with the smell of old copper and ozone. They found evidence of Sato's domesticity: a makeshift bed made of discarded transit uniforms, a small stove hooked into a gas line, and a wall covered in photos of the victims. But the photos weren't of the people as they lived. They were photos of the people as they sat on the train, unaware they were being watched from the air vents. Each photo had a timestamp that matched a specific recording in the archive. The most disturbing discovery was a small, hand-carved wooden doll found on the pillow of the makeshift bed. It was a replica of the child's charm found decades ago, the one that belonged to the first victim. Sato hadn't just kept the mementos, he had lived with them, treating the remnants of his victims like family members. He had built a home out of the grief he caused, nestled in the very infrastructure that the victims' families used every day to go to work. A breakthrough occurred when a forensic linguist noticed a sequence of numbers hidden in the cross-hatching of the blueprints. Shadows. They weren't coordinates. They were employee ID numbers when run through the old mainframe. They matched a current safety inspector who had been working for the transit authority for 20 years under a dead man's name. This man had been the one signing off on the very structural reports the police were using to track him. He was the one who had cleared the Ginza line the night of the ghost sighting. The twist was that the man they were looking for wasn't hiding in the dark, he was standing right next to them. The safety inspector who had been guiding the police through the tunnels for the last 48 hours was Sato himself. He had used a stolen identity to remain on the payroll, effectively getting paid by the city to sabotage it. The realization hit the lead detective as he looked at the man's hands. They were stained with the same red ink used on the blueprint. Before they could react, Sato vanished into a hatch that shouldn't have been there, a trapdoor he had integrated into the floor decades ago. The blueprint was never a guide to help them find him. It was a distraction to lure the entire task force into a specific dead zone. As the heavy steel hatch slammed shut, the lights in the tunnel flickered and died. Sato's voice came over the intercomsystem.com and melodic, thanking them for becoming the final recordings in his archive. The sound of the express train began to roar in the distance. But it felt wrong, too loud, too close. Sato had diverted an automated freight train onto a decommissioned track that led directly into the chamber where the police were trapped. The blueprint's red ink wasn't just a map of the past, it was a sequence of events for the present. He had designed the tunnel to act as a funnel, ensuring that there was no escape from the kinetic energy of the incoming steel. In the final moments, the lead detective noticed a small, unlabeled lever near the ventilation shaft, a detail so minute it had been missed in the chaos. He pulled it, and instead of a door opening, a massive emergency fire curtain dropped, shielding them from the direct impact of the diverted train. The collision was deafening, the screech of metal on metal echoing through the city above, but the task force survived. When they finally broke through the debris to Sato's archive, the room was empty, save for one spinning tape recorder. The tape didn't contain the sound of a victim. It was a recording of Sato's own heart, slowing down until it stopped. They found his body encased behind a glass-like pane of structural resin, inside the very support beam he had marked in red. He hadn't escaped. He had performed his final architectural feat by becoming a permanent part of the station's foundation. He had died weeks before the blueprint was ever found, leaving behind a prequisite sequence of events and a mechanical ghost to finish his work. The blueprint was his tombstone, a final map to a body that will never be removed without bringing down the heart of Tokyo. Every day, millions of people walked directly over the man who haunted their commute. His remains fused forever into the concrete. The city didn't just forget the crimes, it swallowed the criminal whole, turning his malice into a silent, structural secret. Even now, if you stand on the platform at Shinjuku and the wind hits the vents just right, you can hear the faint, rhythmic pulse of a heart that refuses to stop beating beneath the tracks. Some secrets aren't buried in the earth, they are the very ground you're standing on.